Chapter 15. Backlash. 9 months was a very long time. No, actually that wasn't true. 9 months wasn't a long time, and the fact that it wasn't was his present vexation. It was an absolute paradox how he, Obi-Wan Kenobi, could spend 19 years of his life alone in the desert with the weight of the galaxy pressing down on his shoulders, and never, in those 19 years, have ever felt quite as bored as he did now. Absently, Ben felt as though he owed an apology to every pregnant human woman in the universe. He supposed it was the tranquility that got to him. It was absurd that tranquility could aggravate him so much, but Ben hadn't lived in a truly tranquil place in a very long time. The quiet cocoon of the Jedi Temple was peaceful above all. Despite the ruckus of training and daily bustling to and fro, there was a baseline of still and calm. It had been heaven for a while. He could have voluntarily stayed for an eternity, and he would have been happy about it. But then they made him stay for an eternity, 9 months, but it was all the same in the Force, and suddenly he was gnawing at the bars over the windows. It had only been 2 weeks, and Ben had spent most of it holed up in his rooms, and if he was feeling particularly annoyed about the quiet, in the sullies. Qui-Gon had the guts to accuse him of moping. The man was right, of course. This sort of behavior was indigenous to the creche, where toddlers sulked about being put in time-out and glared at the walls out of spite. Ben knew this, but he ignored it. Out of spite. His standoff of wills began to wear off after about 2 weeks, but his vexation over the stillness remained. 54, 55, 56, 57, 58. Ben pulled himself over the bar by his legs, arms behind his head. He'd taken to strength training over saber form today. Fewer Padawans stared at him that way. Well, most Padawans. Master Kenobi! Ben opened his eyes to see an upside-down Garen Moon and posse approaching him, smiling. He recognized most of the Padawans from his saber class. "You're back!" Garen elbowed one of his friends and whispered, "Told you." Ben let himself down from the wall and wiped sweat from his brow. "It's good to see you as well, Padawan Moon. What exactly am I back from?" "Your mission," the learner beamed. "Master D has been teaching your class since you left. It'll be good to have you back, Master." Oh. Ben felt as though he would sink through the floor from the guilt. Garen's smile hurt his heart. "Ah, I see. Well, Garen..." He scratched the back of his neck. He saw some smiles in the crowd waver. Those Padawans whom he knew to be gifted with foresight, which included his younger self, unfortunately, stopped smiling altogether. "I'm afraid I won't be teaching your saber class anymore. I won't be teaching any class, actually." Which was more painful a fact than Ben wanted to admit. Garen's whole countenance fell. "What?" Shock became denial. "Why?" Ben sighed. There was nothing more horrible than being faced with 18 crestfallen younglings and knowing that their broken spirits were your fault. The council has decided that I am not fit to teach." A buzz of quiet, astonished voices. "But you're the best Cereso teacher we've had in ages. Master Dralik said so," said Uli, Herodian eyes tilted in disappointment. Ben tried to smile. "And I'm grateful for the compliment, but I happen to know that Imagundi is an excellent swordsman. His knowledge of Niman far exceeds mine. You should be grateful for his insight." Uli nodded, but wilted a little. She was hoping to specialize in Cereso, Ben knew. But Garen's face was screwed up in thought. Why did the council do that? Even Obi-Wan's face lit up in interest. Ben sighed heavily. Being reckless had its consequences in the Old Republic. He was unused to dealing with them. "There was an incident during my mission. It prompted the council's decision. It's not up for discussion, I'm afraid." A silent buzz of interest rippled through the Force, and Ben tried his best to ignore it. "What happened?" asked one of the less tactful Padawans. "Did you get hurt?" Ben heard someone whisper, "And do a full set of wall stands? Not bloody likely." "It hardly matters what happened," Ben deflected. "The council's decision stands. I'm sorry, Padawans. I wish you all the best in your studies." He gave a light bow, signaling the end of the discussion. Garen frowned as deeply as he dared in front of a master and turned away, shoulders slumped. The group meandered to a different part of the sallies, where it looked as though they were preparing for a group exercise. Obi-Wan lingered. "What did you do?" he asked his older self, equal parts horror and awe in his voice. Ben looked down at him. Ask your master. He's probably read the file by now. Obi-Wan shook his head. He tells me it's been classified. Ben's brows shot up. Has it? Obi-Wan nodded. They stared at each other. When the look of expectation did not leave Obi-Wan's face, Ben sighed and crossed his arms. I acted incredibly recklessly. The council has seen fit to put me under censure. What? Don't look at me like that. You're Qui-Gon's apprentice, for force's sake. Obi-Wan was recovering from his horror. Censure? For how long? He asked. 9 months. The horror returned twofold. Ben resisted the urge to roll his eyes. The master was not ashamed to admit that he enjoyed Obi-Wan's company, but sometimes he had to wonder if he'd actually ever been this prudish. Does anyone know? The scandalized apprentice asked. Ben was ready for the quite literal self-embarrassment to end. I'm sure they'll find out eventually. Padawans do gossip. Ben growled, turning away from his younger self to hoist himself up on the bar. Don't you have classes to attend? With nothing else to say, Obi-Wan turned back to his class, leaving his older self to shrink tranquility through exercise. 59, 60, 61, 62. 3 days later, things came to a head when Ben nearly took someone's arm off. The council had never issued any edict that would keep Ben from the training dojos, and even if they had, he would have ignored it, so he spent a great deal of his time there. He practiced his Dune katas, gave pointers to students, and humored any master or senior Padawan looking for a challenge. Most of his engagement ended in victory, but he accepted them graciously. Ruthless and cunning he may have been, but it could never be said that Ben Kenobi was not a gentleman in combat. But then, Pong Krell walked in the door. Ben had not been there on Umbara when Krell betrayed the 501st, nor had he personally seen the pure dark in him that Rex and the others reported afterwards. But he remembered having not been surprised, because Pong Krell had been a grey presence in the Force for as long as Obi-Wan had been acquainted with him. He'd rarely been on Coruscant, and he'd rarely stayed for very long. That Ben remembered, and he remembered Qui-Gon telling him as a young man that it was because the Council did not trust Pong Krell. Not in the same way they did not trust Qui-Gon. Pong Krell made them nervous, and rightly so. But he was damned good at what he did. So the Council kept him occupied with their greyest missions on the most distant sectors, giving him as little time as possible to return to the unadulterated temple where he could corrupt the peace. But once in a long while, he'd burst into the scene and everyone would grit their teeth until he left. But Ben Kenobi, unused to this unspoken ritual and biting at the bars of his cage of tranquility, leapt at the opportunity. He wasn't the one who picked a fight. When the gargantuan Jedi made his rounds of the sallies and found no willing opponent, Ben said nothing. But eventually, Pong saw Ben practicing in the corner and realized that there was one master present whom he hadn't yet asked to a duel. "You got a pretty little swing there, master." The basilisk's bass voice had never seemed quite fit for a Jedi. "You want to try something a little more challenging?" Lower arms akimbo, Master Krell patted either of his saber staffs at his belt. Ben eyed him. "That depends. Are you prepared to lose?" Oh, he lived for this, fighting with sword and wit at once. Pong guffawed. "Lose? You don't know who I am, do you, little master?" "I know exactly who you are. Bully, traitor, clone killer, darksider. And rest assured, I've taken down far mightier than you, Pong Krell." No one could ever argue that he was wrong. "Funny. I don't remember you at all." "Don't worry. You will." And suddenly, right there in the corner of the dojo, the basilisk and the comparatively minuscule human began dueling each other. Pong drew his sabers first, or so the onlookers would recount to Vokara Che, but Kenobi rose to match the assault with relish. Ben was in his element, dancing under blades and around parries like the old dangerous days. Pong obviously hadn't expected much of a fight, so when Ben refused to be squashed and dashed in and out of the deadly Jakar's torrent like a specialist, the basilisk's jowls began to puff in anger. Ben was oblivious. He no longer saw green and blue, but red, in staffs and in double, in the hands of a human, a Zabrak, a traitor bound for Umbara. Krell let out a loud kaya, bringing both oversized sabers down in an overhead slash onto Kenobi's defense. Krell always had favored a full frontal assault. To the last man, or so that horrible report had read. Ben snarled and threw the basilisk off of him with a force shove. The two circled each other like wild ag dogs, each daring the other to strike. A considerable crowd had gathered, awed Padawans and increasingly worried masters. Someone sent for Master Dralik to intervene when Krell dared his opponent to raise the power setting on his saber, and Kenobi agreed. Krell would never back down. Kenobi couldn't. This was his life's kata. The struggle, the fight, seeing darkness pressing in on all sides, daring his spirit to endure it. It too was a prison, a dark reflection of the temple's stifling calm, but he understood war better than peace. He hated it, but it had been his companion from youth. It was, in a horrible way, comforting. Pong spun, emerald staff bearing down with a static energy no Jedi alive had ever had to face in earnest. None but Ben. As the saber passed him by, Ben struck the staff in two, and the sound plucked a violent chord in his memory. The blades extinguished, leaving the match doused in sapphire light. Pong yelled in outrage and rebounded, but his two left arms were unprotected, and his opponent was a trapped Clone War general stuck between the present and the once was. Ben forgot himself. He struck to hit and did not miss. Pong Krell roared in pain, lower right arm grabbing at his biceps in agony. A single green blade appeared between the duelists. With a flick of his wrist and a none-too-gentle force shove, Sin Dralik pinned Kenobi against the wall. "That is enough!" the saber master commanded. Jarred into the present, Ben disengaged his saber and realized with horror that Pong Krell was bleeding profusely. "Call Master Che," Sin said to the crowd of gawkers going to assess the damage. Ben glanced at the spectators and was mortified to realize that several of his former pupils, including Garen and Reeft, were amongst them. He stepped forward to apologize, but Sin fixed him with a disappointed glare. "You've done quite enough here, Master Kenobi," he snapped. "Leave it alone." Unsurprisingly, Vukara Che wanted to talk to him later on in the day. When he arrived, the halls were quiet. She'd asked to meet him in a secluded back room, the very same one in which he'd woken up months prior. "You asked to see me, Master Che," he said emotionlessly. Vukara stared him down in silence, her leku twitching subconsciously in agitation. She looked at the timepiece on her wrist, stared at the seconds counting down. Ben wondered why. She waited for the chrono to chime the 18th hour. "I'm off my shift now, so you have no grounds to report this," she said. "Report what?" She slapped him hard across the cheek. Head snapped to the side, Ben resisted the urge to rub at it. He supposed he deserved that. He waited a moment. "How is Master Krell?" "He'll live," growled Vukara, crossing her arms to keep herself from slapping him again. "And his arm will be fine in a month or so. No thanks to you." Ben had the grace to flinch. "Force, Kenobi? 90% power? What were you thinking?" Had he been thinking at all, he wondered? If he had, it certainly hadn't been about Krell. He made no reply. "This isn't like you, Ben." Ben looked up at her, resenting her confidence. "With all due respect, Vukara, if they were using first names then, so be it. You hardly know me." The healer was unfazed. "I know Obi-Wan Kenobi well enough to know he'd never grow up to be you. Not willingly." It was meant to sting, but somehow it didn't. Ben had to admit that he'd never thought about how he'd grown up, merely that he'd had to grow up, and grow up fast. He frowned at the unfamiliar notion. He'd grown up all right, but between the Sith, the war, Anakin... Had Obi-Wan been skewed somewhere along the way? And here in the past, did it even matter? "Then you'll be happy to hear that he won't have to," Ben said with glib politeness. He did not meet her gaze. If he had, he would have seen the deep concern in her eyes. The silence between them stretched for ages. There was a chasm there, 42 years of hell turned into limbo that neither could see clearly. The force boiled around Ben in waves of confusion, frustration, and sadness. Vukara could see the indigo veins of fear among them. They had let this fester for far too long. "I serve my shift in the mind-healing ward tomorrow," Vukara told him. "You are my first appointment, 9th hour. Don't be late." She uncrossed her arms and left the room. "You can let yourself out." Ben sighed. He dutifully arrived at the Mind Sealer ward the following morning at 9th hour precisely. Vukara greeted him and led him back to the interview rooms. "Take a seat, Master Ben. Would you like tea?" Ben did not take a seat, and he did not even hear the question about tea. "What are you doing here?" On the other side of the room, Mace Windu crossed his legs and gestured to a chair. "Take a seat, Kenobi." Ben turned to the door, but it was shut. More than that, it was locked. Through the thin window panel, he could see Vukara making her tea, and he glared at the back of her head. She ignored him. "Tea?" Mace offered again from behind. "No, thank you." "Suit yourself." Reluctantly, Ben said, "I was unaware that you were talented in the healing arts, Master Windu," Ben commented dryly, crossing his legs in the way he'd used to in the council rooms. "Mind or otherwise." Mace ignored him and took a sip from a tea bowl. "When I suggested to the council that you'd be put under censure, I was unaware that I would be endangering the well-being of others." "If you're referring to the incident with Master Krell, it was an accident. I have been alive long enough to know the difference between an accident and intention." "Have you?" Mace set down his glass and leaned forward. "Because from where I am standing, you seem to have balanced your place within this order on the edge of a knife. Accidents like that happen to Padawans, Master Kenobi. In a master, it is recklessness, and recklessness of your caliber is something I have only ever seen in younglings." "And Qui-Gon," Ben retorted. "Qui-Gon Jinn understands that his actions have consequences. You do not." Ben squared his jaw. "I assure you, Master Windu, I know more about consequences than you ever will." Mace squinted at him, dark eyes cutting and weighing the measure of his words. Ben's mental shields were tight, but he could not quite block out the perception of that unnerving stare. Mace Windu had not been made Master of the Order for nothing. At length, the Master of the Order said, "You're afraid of the future, of changing things." "I'm afraid of not changing things." "Fear leads to anger. Do not lecture me on the code. You know nothing of what I fear." "Then enlighten me." "I can't." "So you've told me before. But you have yet to explain why. My patience is wearing very thin." "In matters of galactic security, confidentiality is the first defense against disaster." It was a counselor maxim. Mace ticked an eyebrow. "Yes," he said. "Master Yoda said that when he suggested that your mission report be put under clearance level 1. I understand how that might have been, in some shrouded way, a merited decision. But what I do not understand is why you refuse to let us help you, Ben. You cannot expect to fight this war on your own." "Because there's nothing you can do to help. Not now." Ben sighed and shook his head. It felt as though he'd been asked to defuse a bomb without being able to see the wires properly. "This future that I've lived, it's worse. So much worse than whatever you're thinking. But the things I would share with the Council..." Ben thought of Qui-Gon standing in front of the Council, insisting that Anakin was the chosen one. He thought of the day when they had formally declared war. He thought of the session where they'd assigned him to execute Grievous, a unanimous decision made on top of years of laminated fear. Ben passed a hand over his eyes, and when he looked up, Mace was watching him. "At this point in history, it will only make things worse. For the Council, the Order, everyone. You must understand, Master Windu, I do want your help, but right now, I fear it will do more harm than good. Once I involve the Council, there would be no going back." Mace did not look entirely convinced. "Once you get yourself expelled from the Order, there will be no going back." Ben's eyes went to his lap. Touché. After an unproductive silence, Mace heaved a sigh. "Do you really trust me so little, Kenobi?" "That's not it," Ben scoffed. He looked back up, sadness and nostalgia in his eyes. "I trust you immensely. Believe it or not, Mace, in another life, you and I were very close friends. I was a master then, a leading member of the Council. And you were like a father figure to me, especially after Qui-Gon..." He stopped suddenly and shook his head. Mace hid his surprise. "I don't want to have to hide from you, from anyone, but right now, I feel as though there's no other way." "The Force always provides a way, does it not?" "Yes, it does. But not right now. Right now it's not about that, it's about..." He cast about for a thought, a direction. He was missing something, he knew. Some clue, some hidden route that would show him to the next step. It's about my mission. The council will come later, but right now the Force has led me here to... Ben fumbled, trying to focus on the indistinct notion of the Force. He scrambled to match it against the stratagems he had in his mind, but it dissolved like smoke. Mace watched the turmoil play across his face and interrupted. "Kenobi, when was the last time you rested?" Ben frowned at him. What kind of question was that? "I slept last night." "I didn't ask when you last slept. I asked when was the last time you rested." Ben considered the question. It was a difficult one. He floundered, put on the spot. He frowned deeply, finding cobwebs in his thoughts. "Perhaps... when? Before Luke's last birthday? Before his first birthday? Before Anakin? Palpatine? The war? What had rest even meant all those years ago?" "Maybe 22 years," he said eventually. "I suppose it's been about 22 years. Mace let Ben mull on his thoughts for a while before taking a deep breath and saying, "I do not believe the Force has made a mistake in sending you here. I do not even think that it was a mistake to send you to Herdessa, Force help me. But by the same token, it was not a mistake that you were put under censure, Kenobi. You are reckless and obstinate, and it's a rebuke, but it may also be the Force's way of telling you to rest." But the idea was so hard to make comfortable in his head. "I can't change anything from in here. This time I'm here for a reason. I need to be out there, every second of every day. It's coming closer, and I need to do something to stop it." "Then do," Mace goaded. "Mount your defense. Rest is not the same as idleness. You are not trapped here." "Aren't I?" Ben snapped, fists clenching neurotically. The salt in his voice surprised them both. Mace studied him for an intense moment. He looked sad when he guessed, "You haven't been at the temple in a long time, have you? Before all this happened." It had taken him as long to remember what rest was. "No." Mace nodded. He wished Ben would share more, but the more hints he got, the more snippets he gleaned from Ben's slips of tongue, the more he realized that deep down he feared learning the truth. And if Ben could unlock such fear in the entire council, perhaps it really was better to keep the information under quarantine. But that still left Ben. "You wish to change history," Mace began in a new tone, changing the topic. "I believe there's a saying, those who do not study history are doomed to repeat it. The temple does have the largest archives this side of the Outer Rim, you know." Ben looked unimpressed. "You think I don't remember how it all happened?" he asked, insulted. Mace shrugged. "I think you could use a reminder in any case. Read, prepare, rest. Above all, you need to trust the Force, to let yourself trust the Force." Mace stood, and Ben followed suit. "Your actions are important here, Master Kenobi, but so is your peace of mind. Find your center before you misstep again." Ben took a deep breath as if to speak, but in the end he only breathed it out again, exhausted. "I will meditate on it. Thank you, Master Windu." Mace said nothing for a moment. "Next time you decide to fight someone, Kenobi," he said, waving the door open, "remember to use low power for Force's sake." Meditation was hard. "But I have been resting, haven't I? Or have I?" Ben's voice was the only thing to be heard in the arbitorium, aside from the burbling fountains and the occasional snapping of Rixa's dogs. The speaker sighed. "I have been meditating after all. Trying to. Doesn't that count as rest? Surely it should. And I sleep well enough. I understand what Mace meant, but he's always been a bit too intense about these things. I'm fine." He paused and stretched his booted feet out in front of him. "At least, I think I am." He was unused to this confusion. "Force, I'm tired," he complained. As it had for the past hour, the wuxia plan swayed in the air currents without opinion. Ben sighed at it. A familiar croak appeared over his shoulder.
"Thought find you lazing again, I would. But composed you are."
The ancient Jedi used his cane to poke at Ben's donned boots, and Obi with distaste.
"A sign of brooding, it is."
I am attempting to rest, Ben said resentfully, smoothing out his robes.
Resting? You are not. Talking to plants you are.
Yoda chuckled at this as if it were the funniest thing he'd heard all day, and waddled past Ben to consider the indifferent leafy counselor.
A new edition, this must be. Seen it before? I have not.
He stroked the thick blue-green leaves respectfully. A wuxia plant, native to Naboo. I've been growing a smaller one in my quarters.
Yoda
nodded, smiling at the foliage. Eventually he dropped the leaves and turned back to Ben, cane perched at an intelligent angle.
Hold it captive? You do. Why not plant it here, where it belongs?
Ben shook his head, frowning. It's not nearly big enough. It'd shrivel up as soon as it tried to set roots.
Keep it inside, then, for now. When right the time is, where it wants to go, you must plant it. Flourish, then, it will.
His eyes sparkled with a sage-old light as he hobbled back past Ben, whose tabard tails he trod mud on.
But let it outside before it is strong, you must not.
Yoda hopped up onto a large cap of fungi and then up further into a low-standing tree. He found a comfortable crook in its branches and lay there, balancing his gimmer stick nearby. He closed his eyes and hummed contentedly, wriggling more firmly into his spot. He did not move. Master Yoda? Ben began to ask, baffled by this behavior.
Lazing? I am,
the small one replied before the question could finish forming.
Exhausting your brooding is. Bother me with it no more.
Ben frowned at the dozing Grandmaster for several seconds. Eventually, he sighed and leaned forwards to pull off his boots and unbuckle his belt. When he leaned back against the grass and let out a long breath, Master Yoda, eyes still closed, smiled at the sound. Several days later, in a more agreeable state of mind, Ben found his way to the Jedi archives. He'd been borrowing holobooks and news reports on a semi-regular basis since he'd arrived in the past, but he'd mostly aimed to refresh his memory on current events. He hadn't stepped in here with any intention of dredging up old demons, let alone researching new ones. But he needed rest and strength. There was no ignorance, there was knowledge, and through knowledge he would know the Force, and the Force was a powerful ally indeed. He needed allies about now. He was not entirely sure where he ought to start, so he put on a basic search with the name Palpatine and downloaded as many of the relevant files as he dared. He put in a request to view the minutes of a meeting between Chancellor Valorum and the Neimoidian ambassador, but was denied access. He keyed in his access code, but was stonewalled by the same notification. He sighed. Blasted machine. The codes were good, but technology was, as ever Obi-Wan's philosophy had proven, a fickle friend indeed. He approached the front desk expecting to find Jocasta Nu, the temple archivist. Instead, he found a small Twi'lek curled up in Jocasta's seat, feet swinging, nose buried in a hollow picture book. "Hello there, little one," he said. The girl jumped in surprise, sitting up straight and blushing indigo behind a face full of blue freckles. Embarrassed, she pulled up a sagging tabard, which looked as though it had been fitted for her to grow into. Ben smiled at her, and she blushed harder. She brushed her still-playing holobook to the side, as if to make it disappear. Projected above the pages, a rancor bit into a holographic Gundark with gusto. "Is there something I can help you with, Master?" asked the youngling. "Yes, I'm attempting to access his file, but I'm afraid I've run into technical trouble." "Do you have the record number, Master?" "Yes, it's 1819R2622, he recited. He tapped in the numbers with careful deliberation and waited. A notification sounded from the console, and she looked at it uncertainly, hands drawn to her chest. She cast a lost look over her shoulder. "Master?" With her head turned away, Ben was surprised to see a silka bead braid dangling from the base of her right leku. "Yes, Padawan." A tall man carrying a stack of holobooks came out from behind a shelf of unsorted records. "It says I need a passcode." The master looked up from his work. "Oh, yes." He set the holobooks aside and keyed in a code. While waiting for it to register, he frowned at the glowing holopictures at his Padawan station. He scoffed. "Aola, what is this?" Aola stiffened guiltily. Innocent blue eyes swiveled in her sockets to look at the book out of the corner of her eye. Ben resisted the urge to smile. Her master sighed and flipped the book shut. "Go put it back where you found it," he ordered. She dutifully took the volume and slid off of her chair. Without the tall stool, the crown of her growing lacquer only reached to her master's waist. She shuffled away to a distant shelf, leaving her master chuckling and shaking his head. "I apologize," the master said, sitting down in the chair and pausing to readjust it so his knees would fit beneath the desk. "My apprentice has alarming taste in literature." Ben laughed. "Oh, I remember being her age. It comes with the territory. I'm sure as an archivist's apprentice she has more than enough to study." "Oh, I'm no archivist," the man at the desk laughed. "Aula's just very exuberant, you see." He raised his eyebrows meaningfully. "We volunteer for Master Nu's service as an exercise in silence." Ben's face dimpled, and he nodded with experiential understanding. "I see. The master knows best." It's been quite nice for me." Scroll, scroll, scroll. "Now, you want the minutes on the meeting between Chancellor Valorum and the Nemodian consulate?" "Yes, that's it." He typed in a quick code. "Very well. It should be available on your pad now, Master, He glanced at the screen. "Kenobi." He frowned suddenly, head tilting to one side. "Why do I know that name?" "You might be thinking of my nephew, Obi-Wan Kenobi." "Oh." The man's eyebrows rose. "Obi-Wan Kenobi." He looked at Ben keenly. "He's apprenticed to Qui-Gon Jinn, is he not?" "Yes," Ben replied, surprised at the recognition. "You know them?" "Well," the man waved a dismissive hand, "the master. Qui-Gon and I used to... well, we used to know each other back in the day." He smiled up at Ben. "Master?" Aola called in a nervous tone from some ways away. A small crash followed. The stand-in archivist merely sighed. "Well, it was nice meeting you, Master Kenobi, if you'll excuse me." "Of course." Ben took his datapad and bowed. "I didn't catch your name, Master." "Guard," the man offered with a small bow of parting. "Guard," Ben finished with a smile. "Well then, Master Guard, best of luck, and may the Force be with you." He laughed. "Thank you." Ben went back to his rooms, watered his plants, and read until dark, unaware that the records were the discovery of lesser import that day.